Hi, my name is Victoria Espinel. I am the president and CEO of BSA, the Software Alliance. We represent the global enterprise technology industry. So our companies make the products and services that let other companies do what they do. There is a very important conversation happening around the world right now about ethics and technology and how to ensure that we are building technology and using technology in an ethical way. And a significant part of those discussions is centered around the question of artificial intelligence, and in particular, the risk of bias in artificial intelligence. I am very proud that at BSA, we have been working with our member companies on tackling this issue head on. Our companies have often been the companies that are standing up to say that there are challenges that need to be addressed, and we need to do that head on. As part of that, we have launched the BSA's framework to build trust in AI, which is a playbook that companies, governments, organizations can use to try to help mitigate the risk of bias in artificial intelligence. Tackling bias is a difficult job. There's no easy fix and there's a lot of work to be done, but I'm very optimistic that the playbook that BSA has produced is a significant contribution to a thoughtful and responsible approach to artificial intelligence. I'm so happy today to have a conversation to bring together the United States and the EU on this issue to discuss it in large part because there's so much potential, I think, for the United States and the European Union to work together to confront the issue of bias in artificial intelligence. And we have two very distinguished speakers to join us today. So Margaret Vestager, she is the Executive Vice President of the European Commission, a long expert on this. She is joining us from Brussels. She is in charge of ensuring that Europe is fit for the digital age, but she has a long history of being very thoughtful on issues of technology and how to best build it and use it and interact with it. Also joining us today is Secretary Raimondo. Secretary Raimondo is the Secretary of Commerce for the United States. As Secretary of Commerce, she oversees many issues relating to the regulation of technology, but also is someone who has spent a lot of time thinking about ethical use of technology and how we move forward on that. I'm very pleased to have you here together. I am sorry that you are not together in person as you were only last week, but I want to thank you both so much for joining us for this important discussion today. If I could start with a question for Executive Vice President Vestager. So as I mentioned, you all were together last week. That was in part because President Biden and President von der Leyen met last week for the first US-EU summit under the Biden administration, the first US-EU summit since 2014. Executive Vice President Vestager, what do you view as the most significant outcome of the summit in terms of relationships between the United States and the European Union and the European Commission?
Thank you very much for this warm welcome. It's really nice to be with you. This is I think it's one of these discussions that can show what values really mean. And to have values in common, that we can also act upon these values for people to see that this is a real thing. This is not just for a festive speech or whatever. This is for real. And that was also, I think, the atmosphere of the summit. We launched the Trade and Technology Council. It was an honor for me to accompany the presidents in its establishment. And to get to meet Gina in person, it was great, and I think it also shows that after these many months of virtual meetings, you can really establish close ties when you come together. The Trade and Technology Council is a doer. On our side, I will lead it with my colleague, Executive Vice President Valdis Dombrovskis, and we have agreed on a long list of issues ready to engage in hands-on discussions. I think there is a lot of things that we can agree on. because we have these fundamentals in common: cybersecurity, discussing supply chains, the role and responsibilities of our platforms, technical standards, export controls. And I think we need it. We need for democracies to come together. And I think that is the main message in the geopolitical situation that we're in right now, that old democracies who share values should come together and show that we can deliver.
Well, I'm very pleased to hear you say that. I agree with that wholeheartedly. I do think there is often a narrative that the United States and the European Union have a very different approach when it comes to technology. And you hear that in areas like competition law, you hear it in platform accountability, which you mentioned. And yet I have heard President Biden and Secretary Blinken saying on numerous occasions that democracies need to come together to work on the rules and the principles and common ground for how democracies are thinking about the use of technology. So, and I also believe that there's a lot of common ground there. I think the recent announcement of the Trade and Technology Council is really interesting, and so we will be watching with great interest. I say that as someone who is both a former trade negotiator and now has spent decades working with the technology industry. Secretary Raimondo, in terms of artificial intelligence, was there any discussion in the context of the Trade and Technology Council or in the context of the summit about finding common ground between the United States and the EU on an approach to artificial intelligence? And if the answer to that was no, do you think there's potential for that to be one of the areas of common ground going forward?
So first, let me say thank you and good morning or good afternoon to Marguerite. I couldn't agree more about how productive last week was. For me, it was a great pleasure to meet with my counterparts. And I thought the greatest accomplishment of last week was officially launching the TTC. And we certainly have high hopes for the TTC. And I love EVP's Vestager's focus on action, and I share that. We need to move quickly. We agreed last week to identify concrete deliverables that we can get to work on, and deliverables that matter to people, which was a point that I really took away. You know, things, when we talk about data flows, artificial intelligence, cybersecurity, it's very in the clouds and technical. And I think what we need to do, you know, following the EVP's lead, is say, what is, you know, an area of technology that is relevant in people's daily lives? And let's come to consensus on how we will move forward and regulate this area, or move forward and collaborate on this area. So I would say I went with optimism and came away with even greater optimism. With respect to AI, I don't know that we spoke specifically about AI, but I would say a couple of things. First of all, it's certainly an area that we will tackle in the TTC. I think it is vital that America and the EU kind of write the rules of the road as it relates to AI, and write them on the basis of our shared values: anti-discrimination, against bias, equity, transparency. To your point about those who say the US and the EU have wildly different views as it relates to technology, I would push back firmly against that. In fact, I think what we share vastly overshadows our disagreements, because fundamentally what we share are commitments to privacy, commitments to anti-discrimination, commitments to our shared national security, commitments to equity, commitments to democracy. And that, I think we are aligned. The US and the EU remain aligned. And what our challenge is, which is not easy, is to figure out how to, you know, regulate and set standards for emerging technology in a way that allows innovation to flourish at the fastest rate possible and create as many jobs as possible, but that keeps people safe, secures privacy, and holds true to our shared democratic values. And that's the work of the TTC. And one issue at a time, we're going to work ourselves, through these complex issues.
Thank you. So I want to pick up a little bit on the point that you made about regulation. And I'm going to turn back to EVP Vestager. Last month, the European Commission put out a proposed comprehensive regulatory framework. I should note that we at BSA are in favor of regulation or legislation that would require companies to do risk impact assessments and be very transparent in their process for creating artificial intelligence. But as I was saying at the beginning, I think one of the really important issues is not just the companies that are building artificial intelligence, of which there's been a fair amount of conversation, but also the companies that are using artificial intelligence, because that ultimately, because that is a vastly greater number, that has such an impact on, to Secretary Raimondo's point, to how people live their lives and how this technology is impacting them. So both rules around creation of artificial intelligence, but also being thoughtful about how companies that are commercializing artificial intelligence are using it in their products and services, I think is very important. EVP Vestager, I know you have given us some thought about different kinds of risks, and artificial intelligence is being used in healthcare, it's being used to detect fraud, it's being used in cybersecurity, it's being used in a myriad number of commercial use cases. How do you think about risks and how to take those into account in terms of the regulatory framework for Europe?
To what Gina said that we share, and that would be tech optimism. Embracing in full the idea that technology can allow us to do things that would otherwise not be possible, that will enable us to fulfill some of the many promises given over the decades that has not been possible so far. And in that embrace of new opportunities, well, the task is to create the trust that this will not undermine the very society that we're trying to improve. And this is why this discussion about risks and bias is so important, because we would leave the huge majority of AI applications sort of without a regulatory touch if there was no risk to something fundamental in the use case. Maybe also if there's no risk to something fundamental, it's quite nice to know that you're dealing with the machine so that you know it. But only when you get into a situation where there is a risk that you will not be seen. For instance, you apply for a job, you want to be seen with your talent and your experience, but you're only being seen as a woman. And the normal pattern would be that this job should be held by a man, to be very simplistic about it. Here, you would want to make sure that there is not this kind of bias. Of course, you cannot account for any kind of bias, but you can be quite good at figuring out what is the really important thing here. And then I think there is a couple of use cases where we think that it is again something really fundamental, and my guess is that we would share this. Could be the state using social scoring technology, saying, oh no, but we know that you were late paying rent, you were jaywalking, your children were missing school. So these privileges in society, they are now closed off for you. I would expect, broad agreement that kind of use have no place in democracies like ours. Could be the use of subliminal techniques to manipulate you to do something that would cause harm, or sort of, broad blanket use of remote biometric identification in public space so that everyone is basically followed all the time. There are something, I think, really fundamental here that we could grasp for people to say, well, I live in a real society. I'm not living in the trailer of a horror movie that I don't want to see the end of.
I think one of the things implicit in what you said about the principles that we share, and one of the reasons I think it's so important for the United States and the European Union and the Commission to be working on this together, is because of that impact that it has on people's lives. I think the power of the United States and Europe coming together on an approach to artificial intelligence and how it should be developed and how it should be used is creating that example for the rest of the world. So artificial intelligence, like many technologies, is inherently global in its nature. But having the United States and the European Union aligned on those approaches is a powerful example to the rest of the globe. Secretary Raimondo, I want to take this down to moving a little bit from global to more local. When you were governor, you were a strong advocate for using technology in a smart way to allow government to deliver services to its citizens in a way that is as good as it can be, which of course is the role of government. I would be really interested in your thoughts about that, and maybe specifically, given the last year and a half and the global pandemic that we are still somewhat in the midst of, your thoughts on technology and data collaboration, whether or not the pandemic has changed those in any way. But I think artificial intelligence is one of the tools the government can use to deliver services to its citizens. And I'd be really interested in your thoughts on how government can best do that, and whether or not the global pandemic has shaped or changed your thinking in any way.
Yeah, thank you. So first, I want to associate myself with what EVP Vestager just said, which is to say the promise of AI is extraordinary, but as is the danger. And so we need to, take a risk-based approach to regulating AI. And we need to align ourselves to, being innovation friendly, as I said earlier, and have a risk-based approach, but also commit ourselves to safety, non-discrimination, public trust, fairness, respect for privacy, and respect for intellectual property. And if you think about the ways that AI could be used in a discriminatory fashion, or to further strengthen discriminatory tendencies, it is pretty scary. And we have to make sure that will, we won't let that happen. At Commerce, within my department, I manage something called NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology. And we are embarking on an effort to develop an AI risk management framework to support the deployment of AI, but deployment of AI that is secure, trustworthy, and safe. And the key to doing this, by the way, all of this, which is where BSA comes in, is robust industry engagement. It can't be that we government folks sit around and set the rules of the road. And so I want to be very clear from, my perspective that industry needs to lean in and absolutely partner with us and give us feedback and engage with us so that we can accomplish what we need to and not stifle innovation and job creation, but also harness the power, but keep a lid on the danger, is how I think about it. With respect to government, I appreciate, Victoria, what you said. I grew up in the venture capital business. I love technology. I love innovation. I love entrepreneurs. So I always have tried to embrace technology and innovation in my job in government. And if anything, the pandemic just fortified my view in that regard. We saw the power of technology and innovation in the digital economy to bring government services to people. There's massive, whether it's counting the census and using technology to count hard to count populations, or we used artificial intelligence to help people find a job. In Rhode Island, we used an AI powered chatbot to talk to somebody and say, you're out of a job. You're out of a job in a service industry. Would you like to get a new job? What are your skills? These were all the jobs available in Rhode Island, and really match up job seekers with job training and available jobs. Massive improvements in how we delivered healthcare. I did an executive order requiring insurance companies to pay for telehealth. Not surprisingly, people increased the amount of health care, particularly mental health care, that they received. By the way, particularly people who might not have a car, particularly people who, like veterans or men, actually, who might be what we saw, who were afraid or shy or stigmatized about seeking mental health. So, I'm a huge believer that in the same way that business has used technology and innovation to increase the customer experience, the public sector must do that too, and we are way behind, and it's time that we catch up. Last thing I'll say is the same is true for cybersecurity. So we here at the Department of Commerce, unfortunately, prior to my arrival, were the victim of a cyber attack. We've hardened our systems significantly, but every state in America, I can confidently say, is behind in this regard, and it's time that we all catch up.
Secretary Raimondo, thank you for raising that last point, and we would be delighted to have you back to talk more about cybersecurity, which, as you can imagine, we also have many thoughts on. But I want to pick up on something you said and turn to Executive Vice President Vestager. So you talked about collaboration between government and the private sector. As you may or may not know, we at BSA worked with our companies for well over a year, putting together the framework to build trust in AI, as well as working with other experts in the space, researchers, engineers, and others, because this issue of how to try to mitigate the risk of bias in artificial intelligence is of great importance to our members. As you are thinking about the regulation in Europe and how that goes forward, what kind of input is most useful to you in that process?
Well, first and foremost, input is the only way that we can work. And also, it's really inspiring. I admire what Gina just told us about the work and how AI had been put to use in increasing the use of mental health services, in enabling job seekers to be matched with a job. And I think these are very good examples as to how the creation of trust and safety around AI is market creating. Because if you have a public mandate, well, you cannot entrust your social services to use AI if you don't know that it has no bias, if you don't know that it is safe. So I think all the many applications within sort of public sector remit, that market will be so much more open if there is transparency that these technologies, they are safe to use, that you do not end up in a shitstorm because all of a sudden something happened and it turned out that people with a certain postcode or a certain color or a certain gender, they were not seen as the people they were. So I think one should see this not as a restriction, but as a market creation effort. Because trust is I think the most important key for the take up here, and this also means that it cannot be top down. The work that you have done, I think it gives some really thoughtful examples of what it means to work against bias, both the traps that one can fall into, but also how one can avoid that. So, sort of a go-to, maybe not a manual yet, but go-to inspiration as to how to avoid biases. And we have had a very long process to prepare our legislative proposal, starting with sort of an AI community. The last time they were together, it was almost 2,000 people coming. We had 52 experts from all sides of society. That inspired a white paper. That white paper got, huge response from all sides of society. Only on that basis could we produce something that, from the reception of it, I'm proud to see that many people find to be useful. So without the kind of work that you do, that other stakeholders do, I don't think that we can manage this, because technology is everywhere. And if things are everywhere, of course, everyone is invited to take part to get it right.
Well, I could say that at BSA, we're very eager to continue working with you, EVP Vestager, and with you, Secretary Raimondo, on these issues. I want to thank you both for coming here today. I think one of the parts of this conversation that's been most meaningful to me is hearing, not in terms of artificial intelligence, but also in terms of data transfers between the United States and Europe, cybersecurity, export controls, the many different areas where you all believe there's potential for real collaboration between the United States and Europe is so important. As I said, we're very excited about the launch of the TTC, very interested in continuing this conversation. So thank you both very, very much for being with us today. I want to tell others that we have a really terrific panel of industry leaders who have been thinking about this issue for quite some time, ready to continue this conversation in just a minute. So there will be a brief video, and then we will transition to our next panel. So stay with us for that. I think it'll be fascinating. And EVP Vestager, Secretary Raimondo, thank you so much for joining us here today. But thank you for all the work that you are doing on this issue. And look forward to continuing to be in touch.